Let God does next. They called her oppressed. They said she was voiceless. They looked at her hijab and thought it was a prison, not a crown. What we explore, what go and does next. But what if everything you've been told about Muslim women was a lie? What if God does next? What if the truth wasn't what the media showed you? What go and see what does next? What your textbooks taught you, or what society whispered into your ears? What he lets when we let things? Duff. What if the very faith they accuse of oppression is the one that first gave women? Rights the West only recently caught up with. God does next. This isn't just about beliefs, customs, or cultures. This is about truth. God does next. A truth they buried beneath stereotypes. A truth they're afraid for you to see. Because once you see it, and see what God does next, you'll never look at a Muslim woman the same way again. And see what God does next. Before the world screamed women's rights, Islam whispered them centuries ago. And see what God does next. Long before the Western world gave women the right to own property, inherit wealth, vote, or speak out in public, Islam had already honored her voice, her dignity, and her identity. Islam's what God's next. Islam didn't reduce her to an object for consumption. It raised her as a pillar of society, a nurturer of nations, a soul God does next, a soul capable of changing the world. But somewhere along the way, and see we Lord does next, that story was twisted. Her voice was muted in the noise of propaganda. What's me God does next? Her truth was censored by those who feared it. Let's talk facts, not fiction. Does next. Let's look at what Islam truly says. Not what culture, politics. Let go Gopin's name, or flawed traditions have done in its name. Let's take a journey through time, through scripture, out God does next, and through the lives of real Muslim women, past and present, who defied the lies with strength, knowledge, and grace. We begin in the 7th century in the sands of Arabia. Was in God does next. When the world was engulfed in tribalism and women were buried alive at birth. The world saw females as worthless. When we're past what goes next, they were passed like property from man to man, beaten into silence. Denied go education and stripped of inheritance. But then came a man named Muhammad. Today when seepens what God does next. A prophet who looked upon these injustices not with indifference, but with tears. A man who said, "The best of you are those who let go. Best of you art A. The best who are best to their women." A man who stood before his people and taught them that women are not burdens. Next, but blessings. Islam shattered the chains that held women down. What God does next. It gave her the right to her own name, her own wealth, her own choices. When we won and see what God does next, it gave her the right to refuse a marriage, to seek divorce, to own businesses, to lead armies, to be scholars. Did you know the first convert to Islam was a woman? Khadija. A successful, happens when one had God does next. Wealthy, respected businesswoman who proposed to the Prophet Muhammad himself. She wasn't forced. She wasn't silent. She was a powerhouse. And she is still honored today, not just by Muslims, but by any soul who seeks truth, who let go and see what does next. Did you know the greatest narrator of Hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet, was Aisha, his see what God does wife? A scholar, a teacher, a leader. She taught men and women alike. God does next. Her intellect was unmatched. Her voice reached thousands. What God does next. And no one told her to sit down and be quiet. Islam didn't silence her. It let we'd go amplified her. Did you know Muslim women today are doctors, engineers, authors, lawyers, politicians, and activists? What does, not despite their faith, but because of it. Women like Ibtihaj Muhammad, May and C. Wat Dusli, who made history wearing her hijab in Olympic fencing, or Elhan Omar, when we in guard dust. What does next, who stood in Congress wearing her faith on her head and her heart on her sleeve. God does next. These women didn't break barriers by rejecting Islam. What does next? They broke barriers through it. And yet people still say Islam oppresses women. What does next? They look at the veil and see chains. But the woman wearing it says, "Freedom, this is my freedom." Because real liberation isn't about how little you wear, but how much you are respected, and see what God does. It's not about being available for the male gaze. It's about rising above it. What does next? Modesty in Islam isn't about hiding a woman's worth. Explain goes. Explore what God next. It's about reminding the world that her worth goes far beyond her appearance. Next, she is honored for her mind, her character, her soul. You see, God does next. The oppression you think you see isn't Islam. It's culture, politics, war, next, and patriarchy misusing faith. And see what God does is, just like people have used Christianity to justify colonialism, or used democracy to justify wars. People have used Islam to control women. God does next, but that isn't the Qur'an. That isn't the Prophet. That isn't truth. See, God does next. Truth is in the pages of a book that honored Maryam. Mary, more than any other woman in any religious text. A book does next. A book that revealed a chapter named after her. a book that speaks of balance, of honor, of equality. Keep in mind, when the West was still debating whether women had souls, Islam had already declared her a soul, a sign, a miracle. What does next? When others locked her out of education, Islam commanded both men and women to seek knowledge. When others reduced her to a servant, Islam called her a queen of paradise. Yes, yes, there are injustices against women in some Muslim majority countries. When we let God does next. But those injustices are not because of Islam. They are because Islam is not being practiced. There's a difference. Thought go and inicy, just like God does next. Just like the oppression of women in Western countries isn't. Because of Christianity, what does next? But because of people who distorted it, what does Islam? If you want to know the truth about Islam, what does next? Look at the source, not the mistakes of those who misrepresent it, and ask yourself, why is it that in places where women are the most educated and spiritually powerful, hear what does next? Islam is growing fastest among them. In the US alone, the majority of converts to Islam are women. Educated, thoughtful, Wilet Gent, independent women who found in Islam not chains, but wings. To be continued, they said she was brainwashed. See what God can see what does next, yet her intellect shines with clarity. They claimed she was controlled. Yet she made a conscious choice. How can what goes next? How can a woman who walks into Islam of her own free will, who leaves behind God gaze, who leaves thee what comforts, societal praise, and sometimes even her own family, next, be considered a victim of oppression? She is not oppressed. She is awake. Her let God does next. She is strong. She is strong, and she has found a truth that speaks not to her body. Goile what does next, but to her soul. Why do you think so many educated women, lawyers, professors, but go and see what go, and students at top universities are embracing Islam? Do you really believe it's because they've been manipulated? When we explore begins, or is it because they finally found a system that respects them beyond superficiality? Today we exhale, let what God does next. A way of life that doesn't treat them like commodities or trophies. When we low and seize but treasures. In a world that profits off women's insecurities. When what does next? Islam builds her confidence, while others teach her to compete with men. Islam teaches she what go. Isra that she doesn't have to be a man to be valuable. In Islam, a woman is not equal to a man. She is equivalent, not the same. Equal lepens whatkal in worth, but equal in value, equal in reward. The Qur'an says, indeed, the most noble of you does. The Mu'tin is next. Of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. It doesn't say the most male of you. It says the most righteous. Next. Meaning gender is not the measure of honor. Character is. Islam does next ask a woman to be like a man. It asks her to be like herself, in the gulp and see what purest, most dignified, and spiritually empowered form. We explore what God does. It gives her unique rights because she has unique responsibilities. To go and see what daughter. She is a daughter, and Islam says raising her grants paradise. She is next, she is a wife. And Islam says treat her with love and mercy. She is a mother. And Islam says, heaven lies beneath her feet. Let that sink in. God does her. This is the faith they said oppresses her. The same see go and same faith that made her central in every stage of life. The same see what go, the same faith that never objectified her body, but elevated her status. The same faith, a faith that doesn't goznef. Then we let gonth. The same faith that asks her to flaunt herself to be seen, but tells the world to lower their gaze and respect her without asking for anything in return. And see God does next. So why do they fear her? Why do they attack her choices, her voice, her faith? Next. Because she's not easy to manipulate. And see what God does next. Because she doesn't sell her soul for attention. Does next. Because she stands firm when the world tells her to bend. Because splort go and hod does next. Because a woman with faith is more dangerous to a corrupt system than any army. She cannot got be bought. She cannot be owned. She belongs to her Creator. Next, and that terrifies them. You see, the narrative of oppression has a purpose. Next, it justifies invasions. It excuses discrimination. It feeds the machine of Islamophobia. They show go what does next. They show you images of war-torn countries and blame the veil. Knew what goes next. They show you cultural crimes and blame the Qur'an. But they never show you the truth. They never see you and show you the women thriving the women's. Thry you the living under Islamic principles. Gawantpans what does next. The ones, the building communities, leading organizations, raising generations. And we let God does next. And defending their rights through Islam. Not in spite of it. Let Poon see what God does next. They won't show you the Muslim girl who graduated top of her class in hijab. They let go and see what God does next. They won't show you the woman who gave up a modeling career to embrace modesty. They won't survivor. They won't show you the survivor who prayer. How you found healing through prayer. They won't explain what God does next. They won't show you the lawyer who fights for justice inspired by the Quranic command to stand firmly for truth. These women exist. They are real, and they are many, God does need, but they don't fit the narrative. Ask yourself few, who what is next? Who benefits from keeping you blind to that? Why do you teens when we let go? Why do you think Muslim women are spoken about, but never spoken to? Why God does next? Why are their voices filtered through the lens of someone else's agenda? Why at Gowan's nest? Why is their faith always the enemy, but never the answer? Because deep down, we knows, the world knows. If the truth got out, everything would change. Go and see what does next. If people knew that Islam empowered women before the world, even began discussing gender equity, they would see what God does net. They would start questioning the lies they've been fed. If people God does next. If people realize that modesty is not weakness, that's submission to God. God is not submission to men. Today, and see what God does next. And that Muslim women are some of the most resilient and spiritually powerful individuals on earth, the illusion would fall apart. Let's be clear. Islam is lappens when what go is not perfect because of Muslims. Islam is perfect in spite of us. And explore what does next. Every religion has followers who fail its teachings. Every society has injustice. Does next. But don't judge a path by those who stumble on it. Judge it by its source. And the source of Islam is light. The Qur'an teaches, God does next. Do not oppress one another. It commands men to honor women, to provide for them, to protect their dignity, not dominate them. See what God does next. The Prophet Muhammad never raised his hand against a woman. He cooked. He cleaned does next. He cleaned, he listened. He sought the counsel of women. He praised them publicly. He wept at the loss of his wife. He said, go and see what next. The best of you are those who are best to your wives. That was 1400 years ago. And explore we let go and see what God goes today. Echoes today. You want to know what oppression looks like? It's a society what next. It's a society that tells a woman her worth is in her looks. What does next? That she has to be perfect to be loved. That she must be loud to be heard. That she had see what does next. That she has to sacrifice motherhood to be respected. When we let does next. That she must erase her identity to be accepted. That's oppression. Islam says, you are enough, go enough. As you are. With your faith. With your intellect. What does next? With your voice. With your heart. You don't have to sell yourself. What does next? You don't have to change to fit in. And we let go what does next. You were created by the one who makes no mistakes. You are not behind. You are not silent. You are not less. When we lepen does next. You are a woman in Islam. And that is a crown of honor the world will never understand. A day we explore what let go and God does next. You're aiming for a motivational, emotional, storytelling style video, not a lecture or article. Today we go and explore what God doesn't. Headings and brackets break the flow and remind viewers they're watching a script, not experiencing a story. And see what God does next. The absence of structure makes it feel raw, personal, and powerful, which performs better for viral videos.
They didn't come to Islam through culture. They didn't grow up in Muslim families. They didn't even know how to pronounce the word Qur'an properly. But in quiet university libraries, in late night study sessions, in the margins of textbooks and behind closed office doors, they began a journey that would change everything. These weren't lost souls. These weren't rebels. These were the thinkers, the scientists, the professors, the doctors, the engineers, the philosophers, the scholars, the ones who built careers on logic, evidence, and critical thinking. They weren't searching for religion, but something profound was searching for them. And when they found it, they didn't shout it from the rooftops. They whispered it to their souls. They turned to Islam in silence. You might wonder, why would the most educated people in the world, those trained to question, to verify, to challenge everything, choose a faith that is often misunderstood, misrepresented, and misjudged in mainstream media? Why would the very minds society hails as the pinnacle of reason turn toward a religion they were once told was irrational, outdated, or even dangerous? The answer lies not in blind faith, but in something far deeper. Truth recognized by intellect, confirmed by the heart, and experienced by the soul. It began with questions, not small ones, the biggest ones. Who am I? Why am I here? What happens when I die? What is the purpose of life? In their academic journeys, they explored quantum physics, molecular biology, astronomy, anthropology, psychology, and philosophy. They found beauty in design, precision in laws, and elegance in nature. But what haunted them was what all this pointed toward. Everything had a pattern, a balance, a cause, except the purpose of their own lives. And when they opened the Qur'an, it was like the missing chapter of a book they had been reading their whole lives. They didn't find superstition. They found science harmonizing with scripture. They didn't find contradiction. They found clarity. A physicist reads about the expanding universe in the Qur'an and pauses. A neurologist sees verses about the stages of embryonic development and wonders how a desert man in the 7th century could describe what microscopes only recently confirmed. A philosopher sees the core and address free will, morality, and the soul with the precision of a seasoned thinker. The Qur'an doesn't shy away from questions. It challenges the reader to reflect, ponder, think. It was never a book meant for the blind follower. It was a message for the seeker of truth, for the educated mind that refuses to settle for half answers. Dr. Jeffrey Lang, a mathematics professor, lived a life of atheism and skepticism. But when he picked up a core and gifted to him by a student, he didn't find what he expected. He found a book that spoke directly to him, that answered his doubts before he could even form the next one. It didn't just provide religious claims. It understood his pain, his confusion, his intellectual barriers, and in that book he found peace. Quietly, he became Muslim, not to win debates, not to join a group, but to answer a call he had denied for years. Why silence? Because for many of these thinkers, Islam wasn't a social identity. It wasn't a flag to wave. It was a sacred commitment. Something to be absorbed deeply, practiced sincerely, and understood fully before ever being spoken aloud. In a world of noise, distraction, and superficial labels, their transformation wasn't for attention. It was personal. It was real. It was private. They didn't need approval. They needed truth. And still, they kept coming. In elite universities across Europe and America, professors quietly add Arabic books to their shelves. Neuroscientists begin fasting during Ramadan. Software engineers memorize chapters of the Qur'an in their free time. Economists ponder over Islamic financial systems that prohibit interest and promote equity. Political scientists see in the Prophet Muhammad's governance a model of justice and human rights. They don't convert out of emotional desperation. They convert out of intellectual honesty. Consider the story of Dr. Ingrid Mattson, a Catholic-raised professor of theology. Her study of Islam was academic at first, but the deeper she went, the more she found herself unable to deny the coherence and compassion of this faith. She saw how Islam addressed real world issues with divine insight. She eventually embraced Islam, not because she was lost, but because she had finally found what she didn't know she was missing. And it wasn't just her. Yusuf Estides, a former Christian minister, came to Islam while trying to convert a Muslim. But the more questions he asked, the more answers he received. Answers that didn't dodge, deflect, or hide. Answers rooted in evidence, in reason, in revelation. And when his heart caught up with his mind, he took his shahada. Many don't even tell their colleagues. Some don't tell their families for months or years. But in their homes, they pray. They fast. They recite Qur'an. They change their lives, not because someone forced them to, but because their conscience demanded it. Because after all the theories and equations and research papers, they finally encountered certainty. What is it about Islam that speaks so deeply to the educated? Perhaps it's that Islam respects the mind. It doesn't ask you to switch off your brain to believe. It doesn't fear scrutiny. In fact, the Qur'an constantly invites it. Do they not reflect? Do they not ponder? Over and over, it commands the believer to observe the universe, to study creation, to use reason. It tells the reader that faith is not the opposite of intellect. It is the highest fulfillment of it. In a world where religion is often seen as the domain of the uneducated or the desperate, Islam flips the narrative. It calls upon the scholars, the thinkers, the people of deep understanding. It respects knowledge so much that the very first word revealed to the Prophet Muhammad was read, not pray, not worship, read, learn, study, seek knowledge. The Prophet himself said, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." And this emphasis has echoed throughout Islamic history. Muslims led the world in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, not in spite of their religion, but because of it. The most educated see that legacy, and many want to be part of it. There's another reason for their silence: fear. The modern world does not make it easy to be a Muslim. Islamophobia is real. Careers can be jeopardized. Social circles can shrink. Relationships can be tested. But even with these risks, they come quietly, resolutely, powerfully, because the truth, once known, cannot be unknown. Once the light enters the heart, it's impossible to go back to the darkness. Imagine a successful medical doctor who has everything society deems valuable: status, income, respect. But when they read the Qur'an, it touches something untouched. It speaks to them in a language deeper than words, and they realize that the healing they provide to others still hasn't reached their own soul. Islam becomes their remedy, their secret, until it's not a secret anymore. There are engineers who studied the symmetry of structures, only to find that the most symmetrical thing is the moral balance in the Qur'an. There are data analysts who search for patterns in numbers, only to be awestruck by the mathematical miracles embedded in the Qur'an structure. There are chemists who understood molecular bonds, but only found spiritual bonding in the remembrance of Allah. These stories aren't rare, they're increasing. Every year, thousands of people with degrees from Harvard, Oxford, MIT, and Stanford take the Shahada, not with cameras flashing, not with crowds cheering, but alone, silently, often with tears, because they've reached the summit of worldly knowledge and found that the view was incomplete without God. Islam offers something unique, not just faith, but a worldview, a comprehensive system of life, a code of ethics, a rhythm for the soul, a purpose for the mind. It's not just about believing, it's about living, thinking, striving, transforming. And for the most educated among us, it is precisely this wholeness that draws them in. The world tells them that religion is backward, emotional, rigid. But when they touch Islam, they find logic, love, and liberation. They find answers, and sometimes, for the first time, they find peace. You don't have to abandon reason to embrace Islam. In fact, many only found Islam because they followed reason to its ultimate conclusion. Their intellect didn't lead them away from God. It led them to Him. The Qur'an didn't contradict their knowledge. It completed it. There are now Muslim professors who teach evolution and still pray 5 times a day. Muslim economists who quote both Adam Smith and the Prophet Muhammad. Muslim psychologists who understand Fred and still say Allahu Akbar with conviction. They see no conflict, because Islam for them isn't an escape from thinking. It is thinking at its highest level. And so they come. The physicists, the philosophers, the PhDs, not in waves of noise, but like rivers underground, powerful, patient, unstoppable. They are finding something the world cannot explain, but their hearts cannot deny. They are turning to Islam in silence, because truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be heard. And once it is, the most brilliant minds in the world can no longer ignore it. Headings break the emotional and narrative flow. For a video script, especially when aiming for a viral, cinematic, or heart-touching delivery, keeping it as a continuous, uninterrupted monologue makes it feel more personal, authentic, and immersive. Like a conversation or an inner voice, not a lecture.
They say a single moment can shatter everything you thought you knew. That one sentence, one conversation, one glance at a soul so filled with peace that it unsettles yours. I never believed in such moments, until I watched him walk on stage, not as an actor,
not as a celebrity, not as the Denzel Washington the world admired, but as a man who had found something deeper than fame, louder than applause, and more permanent than any film role. What I saw that day changed everything. Not just what I believed about faith, but what I understood about purpose, struggle, surrender, and truth. I had grown up idolizing Hollywood. To me, the pinnacle of success was a golden statue on a shelf. Your name lit up across screens from Times Square to Tokyo. I devoured every film Denzel starred in, not just for entertainment, but because he embodied everything I thought I wanted: confidence, recognition, success, impact. He was the voice of righteousness in the courtroom, the hero in the battlefield, the man who never broke under pressure. But the real Denzel, the man behind the characters, was walking a road I had never truly understood. A road that led not to cameras but to more clarity. Not to fans but to faith. It started with a speech. One of those rare moments where you expect glamour and instead you get raw truth. He stood there, firm but humble, and said something that pierced straight through the applause. Put God first, not the universe, not energy, not good vibes. God, the Most High. And he said it with conviction, like it was oxygen in his lungs, not just words on his tongue. Something stirred in me, something uncomfortable. I brushed it off, but I couldn't forget it. Then I watched more interviews, public talks. He wasn't talking like most celebrities. There was no fluff, no feel-good generalities. He spoke of the devil. He spoke of accountability. He spoke of the soul. And then one day, he said something that shattered me. This life we're living isn't the final one. It's just preparation for what's coming. It was a seed I didn't ask for, but it had been planted. Up to that point, Islam wasn't even in my peripheral vision. I thought I knew it, or at least enough to stay indifferent. I believed in God vaguely, culturally, maybe even conveniently, but I didn't pray. I didn't fast. I didn't care. Faith was something you tucked into the bottom drawer until your wood collapsed. But this man, this icon, was living like it mattered every single day. And the more I learned about him, the more I started learning about the faith that kept surfacing around him. You see, what the media didn't always say out loud was that Denzel Washington had been deeply moved by Islam for years. He grew up in a Christian household, but in his path through the industry and life, he encountered Muslims, actors, directors, friends, whose discipline, humility, and spiritual clarity left a mark on him. He saw something in their way of life, their submission to God, that couldn't be denied. And he wasn't the only one. I began noticing how often Islam was subtly woven into the lives of people I respected but never really understood. In interviews, Denzel would speak about discipline, prayer, purpose. And even though he referenced Christianity, there was something profoundly universal and familiar about the values he held onto. I didn't know at the time, but those values were deeply aligned with Islam. And when he spoke about submission, not to fame, not to man, but to God, I started to hear the echo of something ancient, something unshakable. One day, I read a quote where he said, "The enemy is the inner me." It stopped me cold. That wasn't just wisdom. That was a reflection of what Muslims call the nafs, the ego. In Islam, the biggest jihad isn't a war outside, it's the war inside. Against your pride, your greed, your lust, your selfishness. Denzel was speaking truths that were dripping with Islamic meaning, even if he hadn't explicitly said the word Islam. And it wasn't forced. It wasn't a performance. It was lived. That's when I started digging. What I found humbled me. He had once played Malcolm X, a man whose transformation through Islam shook the entire world. But it wasn't just a role to Denzel. It was a journey. He immersed himself in Malcolm's speeches, his faith, his pilgrimage to Mecca, his willingness to die for truth. Denzel didn't just act. He absorbed. He respected. And behind the scenes, those who worked with him spoke of how it changed him. He fasted during filming. He read the Qur'an. He felt the weight of what he was portraying. I kept reading, I kept watching, and somewhere between his speeches and his silence, I began to feel the mirror turning back on me. Here was a man who had everything I thought I wanted: fame, fortune, power, and he was pointing away from it. He was saying it wouldn't last, that your name in lights won't save your soul, that your trophies won't follow you into the grave, that the only thing that matters is what you do for God, and that God isn't impressed with who you pretend to be, only with who you are when no one's watching. I started thinking about my own life. What was I chasing? Whose approval was I trying to earn? I had spent years trying to be somebody, but I didn't even know who I was. I'd wake up and check social media before I prayed. I'd spend hours crafting my image, but not 1 minute refining my heart. I'd scroll through highlight reels of people I'd never meet and yet feel like I wasn't enough. Denzel's words started shaking that illusion. Don't confuse movement with progress, he said. You can run in place and get nowhere. That hit hard. I had been running in place for years, and then came the part I wasn't prepared for, my introduction to Islam. Not through a textbook, not through a documentary, through observation, through the calmness in the eyes of Muslims I had once overlooked, through the unwavering peace in their prayers, the gentleness in their greetings, the sense of order in their lives. I used to think religion was about rules and guilt, but what I saw was love, structure, direction, surrender. Islam wasn't about control. It was about freedom. Freedom from the ego, from the chaos, from the emptiness I'd been trying to fill with noise. And Denzel, whether he realized it or not, was one of the messengers in that journey. Not a prophet, but a pointer. A voice that whispered through the layers of my distraction. Look deeper. The deeper I looked, the more I realized how far I had drifted from any sense of divine purpose. I had traded meaning for momentum, depth for decoration. But Denzel's quiet strength, his unshakable focus on God despite the flashing cameras and constant praise, made me question everything I had prioritized. He wasn't chasing trends. He was anchored in truth. And that anchor wasn't a script or a role. It was something deeper, something eternal. One day I watched an interview where he was asked about legacy. The host expected him to talk about awards, movies, achievements. But Denzel leaned back and said, "What I do for myself will be gone when I'm gone. What I do for others, and for God, will live on." He paused and added, "At the end of the day, it's not about how much you have. It's about what you've done with what you've been given." It was like being struck by lightning. I realized I had spent so much time obsessing over what I didn't have, and zero time asking myself why I had what I did. My gifts, my breath, my time, it was all on loan, and I had no idea who I was supposed to pay it back to. I started reading the Qur'an cautiously at first. I didn't tell anyone. I was still afraid of what people would think, but every page felt like it was written for me, not in a pudic way, in a piercing way. It called me out. It didn't sugarcoat anything. It asked questions I couldn't ignore. Who created you? Why do you chase what will decay? Why do you love this world more than the next? Are you truly in control? Denzel once said, "You'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse." That line echoed in my mind every time I saw people fighting over things that would turn to dust. It made me realize that this life, no matter how shiny, is temporary. And that truth isn't meant to depress us. It's meant to wake us up. We are here for something greater than ourselves. And the only path that gave me clarity, peace, and structure on that purpose was Islam. The discipline that I saw in him, the accountability, the refusal to fold under pressure, the constant redirection to God. It all reflected what Islam commands. Daily prayer, humility, charity, fasting, remembrance. I saw in him what I was reading in the Qur'an. And that's when the line blurred. I no longer saw Islam as the other. I started seeing it as the mirror that had been trying to find me all along. I remembered the way Muslims would say, Inshallah, God willing, when talking about future plans. How they said, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God for the good and the bad. How they greeted with the peace and meant it. How they prayed not just on Fridays, not just when life collapsed, but 5 times a day every day, like clockwork, like breath, like love. And slowly, my heart softened. The anger I carried, the confusion, the arrogance, it all began to dissolve. I began to see myself as a servant, not the center. I began to crave silence, not noise. I began to want what Denzel had, not the fame, not the money, but the peace, the alignment, the submission, because he wasn't perfect. He never claimed to be. But he was honest, and his honesty led me to mine.